Good morning, everyone. My name is Stella Youngzi Sherpa, and I'm a clinical psychologist, also a UGC NET JRF awardee. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to today's lecture class. In this lecture class, we will be focusing on one of the most significant areas of psychological testing, that is, the application of psychological tests in clinical setting. Psychological testing is not merely about administering a questionnaire or scoring a scale. It is about using scientifically validated tools to understand human behavior, diagnose mental health concerns, guide interventions, and ensure that our clinical observation or the clinical decisions are evidence based. They also give us objective, reliable, and meaningful information about person's cognitive, emotional, and behavioral functioning. As the American Psychological Association emphasizes in its ethical principle of psychologists and code of conduct, assessment is a core of professional activity in psychology, and it requires competence, fairness, sensitivity to individual rights. In this lecture, we will learn about application of tests in clinical setting, especially when it comes to intelligence test. Then we have neuropsychological assessment, behavioral assessment, career assessment, okay, computer assisted psychological assessment. Then we have ethical and social consideration in psychological testing, okay, and last, ethical principles of APA. By the end of this lecture, you will gain comprehensive understanding of the application of psychological tests in clinical practice, as well as ethical principles that safeguard their use. Now that we have an overview of applications of psychological testing in clinical setting, let us begin with one of the most widely used and fundamental forms of assessment, that is intelligence test. What are intelligence tests? Intelligence tests are tests that are designed to measure the capacity to acquire or apply knowledge, reason, and solve problem. Now, what do intelligence tests really measure? They measure different domains, mental functioning such as reasoning, memory, verbal skills, perceptual spatial skills, processing speed. Okay, it is not just about bookish knowledge. They measure how well a person thinks, solves problem, and adapt to new challenges. Why do we need intelligence tests? It is because in clinical it is used in clinical and applied setting for diagnostic purpose to identify a condition like intellectual disability, learning disorder, any kind of cognitive decline. It also helps in education planning, spot children with who needs special education or gifted programs. In clinic, it also helps in clinical decision making, such as provide baseline data for treatment and rehabilitation after conditions like any kind of neurodevelopmental delays or brain injury or epilepsy. Also, it is used in legal administrative field, that is used for disability certification like the RPW Act in 2016 in India. Okay, also it's used for scientific support. They provide standardized objective measures for clinical observation. In short, intelligence tests guide diagnosis, planning, treatment, and policy making as well. Why do we need intelligence tests? It is important. We need intelligence tests in some situations, such as in childhood to assess any kind of developmental delays, in adulthood to detect any kind of cognitive decline, for school readiness to check if the child has a preparedness for formal education, in rehabilitation to track recovery after any kind of surgery, brain injury, or any kind of delay. Okay, and also for legal purposes for any kind of disability certification. Intelligence testing is applied across the lifespan from childhood, from infant, early development to old age, clinical care, also to legal context. Okay, who can administer? Intelligence test requires specialized training. RCI guidelines says that only highly professional and trained licensed clinical psychologists, psychiatrists, social social psychiatric social workers with minimum M.Phil degree can assess or can administer this test. Okay, It is important because it influences life-changing decisions such as education, disability, certification, government benefits. Misuse can lead to serious harms like wrong labeling. Okay, let's take an example of a 10-year-old boy who is referred to school because of poor academic performance and has difficulty keeping up with the peers. Teachers suspect a learning disorder. When they go to a clinical psychologist, they administer Binekama test, and his IQ falls around 70, confirming intellectual disability. Based on this assessment, he becomes eligible for special education and support. So basically, it was suspected the learning disability, but it was not learning disability, it was intellectual disability. Okay, next we have neuropsychological assessment. Neuropsychological assessment is another important assessment. Okay, it helps this assessment, they help understand cognitive capacity in a deeper level. It evaluates cognitive functions associated with any kind of in different brain system, in any which is such as memory, attention, executive function, visual spatial skills. Okay, these assessments are especially useful when there is any kind of brain injury, brain disease, brain any kind of post-operative care. Okay, it's required. Any kind of cognitive decline, sudden cognitive decline. Okay, this is used when there is any kind of neurological conditions suspected as well. According to the definition, the evaluation of individuals' cognitive, emotional, and behavioral function that relies on standardized tests and procedures to determine the relationship between brain function and behavior is called neuropsychological assessment. They measure attention, concentration, memory, executive functions, okay, language skills, visual spatial skills. Then we have processing speed, motor and sensory coordination, also emotional and behavior regulation. Why do we use it? It is used for diagnosis or differential diagnosis. Let's say depression versus pseudo depression versus pseudo dementia versus pseudo dementia versus dementia. Then we have Alzheimer's versus vascular dementia. Okay, it also helps in treatment planning, cognitive rehabilitation, family education. It also helps in monitoring progress when it comes to any kind of uh, patients with dementia or brain disease such as encephalitis, etc. Okay, when do we use it? We use it when a child has any kind of neurodevelopment delays or neurodevelopment disorders such as autism, ADHD, or even learning difficulties. Okay, it can also, if the child has suffered from any kind of brain disease, meningitis, encephalitis. Okay, it also used in Alzheimer's, Parkinson's. It is used for recover. This neuropsychological assessment is also used after recovery from surgery or traumatic brain injury and long chronic disorders, mental disorders, or even COVID. Okay, who basically this assessment, neuropsychological assessment, again similarly like intelligence test, can only be assessed conducted, or it can be used by the licensed clinical psychologist or specialized who requires specialized training. Okay, only they can conduct neuropsychological assessment. Okay, it is basically psychiatrists, clinical psychology, licensed clinical psychologists, and also psychiatric social workers. Okay, let's take an example of a 50-year-old a lady who's a teacher, complains about memory lapses. So the clinical psychologist administers an enhanced neuropsychological battery, and the results show delay recall and executive there is a defect in executive functioning, but relatively intact visual spatial skills. Let's take an example. So it says that this pattern is consistent with early Alzheimer's disease rather than any kind of other dementia or any kind of brain disease. Okay, the first clinical plan would be referring to a neurologist. Okay, and evaluation of that individual, again initiating any kind of cognitive rehabilitation and documenting for disability certification. Next we have behavioral assessment. In behavioral assessment, okay, it's very important. It is basically lets us know that it's important. It's not just questionnaires and asking questions. Behavioral assessment basically focuses on person's who actually behave, how do they behave in real life situation, in structured tasks, or when, or how do they respond to ambiguous stimuli. Let's say behavioral assessment is central to clinical psychology because ultimately psychological disorders are expressed not only through thoughts and feelings but also is through observable behaviors. Let's say, what is the definition of behavioral assessment? The definition is that it is an empirical measurement of a person's overt behavior as well as environmental factors that influence those behavior for the purpose of clinical decision making. Let me repeat this again. Behavioral assessment is an empirical measurement for person's overt behaviors as well as environmental factors that influence those behaviors for the purpose of clinical decision making. It emphasizes direct observation or functional analysis of behavior. Okay, then contextual understanding when, where, with whom the behavior occurs. Okay, it measures the frequency, intensity of any kind of behavior, antecedent and consequences. It also tries to see patterns across contexts. Also, they try to understand any underlying processes. Okay, let's say, can it be objective? Okay, it can be objective by counting behaviors. Okay, it can be projective also by interpreting symbolic responses like what we do in Rorschach's in blood test. Why we use it? Why do we need to use behavioral assessment? It is used in diagnosis. Generally behavioral assessments are done by parents, also by clinicians, and by teachers as well when it comes to children with any kind of learning disability or with a child with any neurodevelopmental disorder such as ADHD or autism spectrum disorder. Okay, or even conduct disorder. It helps in treatment planning through behavior therapy, cognitive behavior therapy, parent training. It helps monitor, any kind of change, if there's any change. Also assess any kind of risk assessment is done, suicidality, aggression. Okay, then, okay, well, when do we use it? I've already said it. We use it when a child is suspected of having autism spectrum disorder, ADHD. In adolescent, it can be aggression, substance use disorder. Okay, it can also be, let's say, any kind of personality issues that adolescent might have. Okay, in adult, it can be mood or personality disorder or even forensic cases. Okay, the types of behavioral assessment that can be used are child behavior checklist, Connors rating scale. Okay, direct observation can also be done through functional analysis. Okay, projective tests such as Rorschach or CAT or TAT. CAT is child apperception test. Thematic apperception test is TAT. Okay, then, who can administer it? Rating scales can be completed by parents, teachers, interpreted by psychologists, and psychiatric observation by psychiatrists, behavior therapists, and applied behavior analysts can also be done. Let's take an example of, let's say, a 9-year-old boy who is referred to for aggression and poor classroom performance. Children's fill the Connor rating scale shows that elevated hyperactivity and impulsivity. Okay, direct observation through ABC analysis shows aggression occurs mostly when they are denied any kind of breaks during tasks. Okay, they TT projective test okay reveals the themes of frustration and rejection. Okay, the integrative report generally would say something like, the diagnosis, a preliminary diagnosis of ADHD with oppositional traits. Behavior motivation can be used at school, parent management, training, and consideration of medication can be done. Okay, and there should be also follow up. Okay, next we have is career assessment. Career assessment is very important in today's world. Complex and it's complex and competitive, right? And choosing the right career is not just about academics but also about matching one's attitudes, aptitudes, abilities, and interests. Okay, now career assessment is basically the evaluation of individuals' interests, attitudes, values, and personality. Also, their characteristics for the purpose of vocational guidance and career development. Let me repeat the definition again. Career assessment is the evaluation of a person's interests, interests, aptitude, values, okay, and personality, okay, for the purpose of vocational guidance. Vocational guidance. Okay. Also, this helps in career development. In simpler terms, it is a systemic process of helping individuals understand themselves and make informed choices about education, training, and career. All right. Uh, let's move on. Why? Why do we need it? Why do we need career assessment? It is needed in educational planning. Okay, career choice. If there is a career transition, if any kind of self awareness is required. All right, we use it for adolescents in high school, college going students, working adults, rehabilitation settings. When we say rehabilitation settings, is it post illness, they've lost any functionality, or they're unable to they've been fired from the job because of their illness, or maybe because of substance use recovery. Okay, and then career assessment is done. All right, now who can administer it? Career assessment can be done by professionals, RCI licensed clinical psychologists, also psychologists trained with career counselor as career counselors. Okay, let's take an example. Let's say a 16-year-old girl with uncertain whether to pursue science or humanities after 10. Okay, according to some of the assessment that was done, it shows that she has strong interest in artistic and social domains, and her aptitude test says that above average verbal reasoning and average numerical skills. Work values, she has basically high preference for like creativity and helping others. So the integrated report would say that instead of going for like science background or commerce background, she can go for humanities, okay, where they require social work. Okay, career assessment is not just about predicting your future. This is basically about understanding who you are and what you value and where your strengths lie. Whether it's a teenager choosing a college stream, an adult facing let's say a career shift, or a person who's planning disability rehabilitation. Okay, or they are moving out of a rehabilitation, or career assessment provides evidence-based guidance for also making informed and fulfilling choices. Next, we move on to a very important type of assessment, that is computer assisted psychological assessment. With the growth of digital technology, psychology has shifted from pen and pencil to computer based formats. Today, computers are not just used to deliver tests but also to score, interpret, and even simulate real world environments through, let's say, those technologies that we have, that is virtual reality, VR. This integration of technology makes assessment faster, more accessible, and more accurate, but at the same time it raises important ethical and professional concerns that we must keep in mind. What is computer assisted psychological assessment? The use of computer technology in administration, scoring, and interpretation of psychological tests. It includes test administration, automated scoring, interpretive reports, database storage, and statistical analysis. What do computer assisted psychological assessment test? They test across many domains. It can be cognitive ability, personality, neuropsychological assessment, behavioral responses, ecological real world simulations, etc. Let's take an example of Cambridge Neuropsychological Test Automated Battery. Okay, a computerized neuropsychological battery widely used in clinical and research setting. Okay, VR Everyday Assessment Lab, that is VREAL, a VR-based neuropsychological test battery designed to simulate daily life challenges, including ecological validity. Why do we need this kind of computer assisted psychological assessment? The major advantage is efficiency and speed, accuracy and standardization, remote accessibility, ecological validity, and data analysis. Let me repeat it again. So when I say efficiency and speed, basically large group can be tested in once. There's accuracy, it eliminates any kind of clerical errors, ensures uniform administration. Remote accessibility, online testing allows assessment during pandemic or any rural areas. Ecological validity can be VR-based tests can replicate real-life tasks. Okay, it also helps form large data sets for any kind of future research and predictive modeling or early detection of any kind of disorders. Why do we need this kind of computer-assisted psychological assessment? In clinical setting, it is important to use it for screening any kind of disorders. In hospital setting also it is required, okay, especially for patients with traumatic brain injury, stroke, educational context. Also it is required for aptitude and career testing, okay. Now let's move on to the next point, that is ethical and social consideration in psychological testing. This is very important. We have to understand this in details, okay. We have to turn to this most important aspect of psychological testing, that is ethics, again I'll repeat, and social responsibility. No matter how scientifically advanced our tests become, if they are misused, applied unfairly, or interpreted incorrectly, the consequences can be deeply harmful to individuals and society. Ethics form the backbone of responsible psychological assessment, okay. The American Psychological Association has laid down core principles. We'll talk about that later. And first, now let's explore the major ethical and social consideration in detail. Okay, the first one is user qualification and professional competence. Very important. Psychological testing is not simply giving a questionnaire and collecting scores. It is basically requires technical expertise in testing, in test theory, in standardization, reliability, validity, norms, and cultural adaptation. Sorry, a psychologist must be adequately trained. Okay, it must have a proper degree. Let's say in India, we require an RCI license that we get after our M.Phil in clinical psychology, and they must be adequately trained before using any kind of psychological test. Let's take an example of Wechsler's Adult Intelligence um, Scale 5, the new one. Mishandling may wrongly label a child as intellectually disabled. Okay, let's take an example of neuropsychological assessment required the same level of education, same level of training, and same level of degree. Only clinical psychologists and neuropsychologists trained in brain behavior relationship should interpret it or conduct it. Okay, next we have protection against protection of privacy, or protection against any kind of confidentiality breach. One of the sacred duties of psychologists is to protect client data. Test results are deeply personal and often reveals vulnerabilities, mental health status, or even cognitive impairment. What do we know about confidentiality? Confidentiality means results can only be shared with informed consent. Records must be securely stored. It should be encrypted or locked up. And when transferring records, it must be done very, carefully. Let's take an example. A child undergoing school testing should not have their IQ report casually being shared among teachers, okay, and staff members without explanation. This can lead to labeling and a lot of social stigma. Informed consent is central here. Before testing clients, okay, or parents or guardians, they must be told the purpose of the test, the possible outcome, their rights, including the right to withdraw, etc. Next, we have test related factors. Is very important. What are the different test related factors when it comes to ethics? Okay, first is test security. Test security, that is test materials, manuals, scoring key must never be disclosed in advance or misused. Sharing items online, photocopying test booklets, or leaving them unsupervised while testing violates ethical codes. This ensures that the integrity of the test and also protects future examinees. Let's take example of some tests that are already online, like the pictures of Rorschach in block test that is publicly available. Okay, this basically reduces uh, you know uh, the diagnostic value because the responses are already contaminated through prior exposure. Test fairness and bias. Tests must be appropriate for the individual's background. Using a test that is developed in the West without any cultural adaptation can result in unfair test outcome. Factors such as language, education, socioeconomic background, disability status must be considered. Okay. Next, we have let's take an example of this test fairness and bias. Let's take an example. Let's say in English based aptitude test is given to an individual from rural Assam who is only fluent in Assamese without translation or adaptation may underestimate their true abilities. This aligns with the ethical principle of justice, ensuring fairness and equal access for all groups. Next point is responsible interpretation. Test scores are not just labels, they are data points requiring contextual interpretation. Psychologists must integrate test results with care, with clinical judgment, interviews, and behavioral observations. Okay. Let's take an example. A low memory score on any intelligence test or neuropsychological test might reflect either poor attention due to anxiety. Okay, it does not necessarily mean that person has an lower IQ or intellectual disability or any kind of brain damage. Now let's move on to another, the last that we haven't discussed initially, that is ethical principles. APA. There are basically 5 core ethical principles that guide all testing practices. The first one is beneficence or non-maleficence. Remember, beneficence and non-maleficence. That is to do good and avoid harm. That is the core principle of testing. We should not harm that individual in any way, and we are supposed to do good. Then there is fidelity and responsibility. We have to uphold the trust with clients and act very responsibly. We cannot just assess a client and keep talking about the client's report with everyone and anyone we come across. Okay. Then we have integrity, to be honest and accurate while reporting. We suppose a child has intellectual disability, we have to be honest with the parents and we have to report accurately. We cannot be like, okay, the child has some delays, okay, they'll get better with proper training, and we are not giving the diagnosis. That cannot be. Then point 4 is about justice. It ensures fairness, equal access, and non-discrimination. So any kind of assessment should ensure fairness. It should be equally accessed. Okay, and there should be no discrimination. Suppose assessments saying that Hispanic population is intellectually their IT score is lesser than uh, the Asians. So that kind of discrimination will not be allowed. There should be respect for rights and dignity. We should obviously safeguard confidentiality, respect cultural values. Okay. In summary, psychological testing is not merely technical procedures. It is an ethical act with profound social consequences. Only trained professionals should use and interpret tests. Privacy, confidentiality, and informed consent must be respected at every step. Tests must be fair, valid, and culturally adapted. Above all, we must remain faithful to ethical principle of beneficence, okay, justice, integrity, respect for human dignity. When ethics guide practice, testing becomes a powerful tool for healing, empowerment, and justice. So in this lecture, at the end, we have to understand that we've walked through the applications of tests in clinical psychology, basically, from intelligence to neuropsychological evaluation to behavioral and career assessment, highlighting the growing role of computer assisted methods. Critically also, it is underscored the ethical foundations, okay, the professional competence, privacy, and test security, especially fairness. So that must guide all assessment work. It should be part of all assessment work. Each step should be grounded in current verifiable sources, ensuring accuracy, adherence to professional standards that we follow, that is APA. Okay, so now that we come to the end of our lecture, we have gone through the application of psychological testing in clinical setting, and it is very important in clinical setting, as you've seen, because we want to understand what is the importance in clinical setting. Why assessment? It is not just observation, but it is also about assessment through various methods. Okay, we come to the end of our class. Thank you.